Until this day, my memory of that summer afternoon remains vividly clear. The entire sky seemed to be torn apart by murky gray clouds, forming jagged, scattered patches. Occasional golden rays of sunlight pierced through, reflecting off the glass panes of tall buildings, dazzling passersby, and lingering in the air that streamed through the window. I carried a cold bubble tea, bought from a small roadside stall, and sat waiting for him below the office building. I didn't know why, but starting early that morning, he had seemed unusually different. His face was pale, his hands and feet icy cold. He hadn't even eaten breakfast before hastily rushing out of the small rented room we shared. Just a moment ago, perhaps an hour earlier, he had called me, his voice hoarse, asking me to come to his workplace at noon to find him. Though I harbored doubts, I still followed his instructions. What could be going on? I wondered, lifting my head to look at the high sky above. Last night it had rained as if the heavens were pouring, with thunder rumbling and lightning flashing so fiercely that even now, the pungent smell of rainwater still hung heavy in the air. The deep blue sky, having been cleansed by the downpour, was now crisscrossed by white and gray clouds, leaving jagged lines. Occasionally, they parted just enough to release golden shafts of sunlight, glinting off the glass facades of the towering buildings, waiting to assault human retinas. Then I heard his footsteps. Humans are beings with souls. For instance, at this moment, the footsteps I heard were merely sounds created by physical agents, nothing simpler. Yet, someone who truly knew him could recognize them instantly. I happily turned around and said, "Oh, what's the rush?" The words had barely left my mouth when my smiling face, just a second before, froze. I couldn't utter another sound. His complexion was terrible, so terrible it reminded me of the zombies in apocalypse movies. Was he sick? I thought, maybe he caught a cold from leaving the window open the past few nights, or perhaps the dinner had some ingredients he wasn't used to. Finding no clue, I eventually put the bubble tea down and walked over, grasping his icy cold hands tightly. His hands were so cold they were unbearable. "You're really sick. Why didn't you say anything this morning? We should go to the hospital right away," I said. I placed my hand on his forehead. Perhaps it was my imagination, but in that fleeting moment as I reached out, his body stiffened slightly, though he didn't stop me. After a moment of silence, his forehead felt as cold as his hands, not burning hot as I had imagined. A sense of panic began to well up inside me. I tremblingly ran my hands over his entire body, ignoring the bewildered glances of passersby. Beneath my touch, the cold temperature never changed. Only his hair and the fabric of his clothes, directly exposed to the sunlight on his shoulders, retained a faint, familiar warmth. I forced myself to calm down and spoke, "Let's quickly get a taxi to the hospital." I turned to hail a cab, but he pulled me back, holding me tightly in place, unable to move. His face was pale, his hands frigid. He squeezed my hands and told me, "What should I do? I can't breathe anymore. It seems my heart has stopped beating too." His voice now sounded even hoarser than that morning, almost strange. It seemed not to be a voice produced in the usual way, but merely a sound created by strained vibrations in his vocal cords. This was the beginning of his old story. I took a taxi with him back to our small apartment. I didn't know if it was because talking was too difficult for him or if he simply didn't want to talk much, but as soon as we stepped through the door, he lay down on the bed, his eyes shut tight and motionless. I couldn't describe my emotions at that moment. I must have been so terrified that I lost my ability to react. After several hesitant attempts, as if to confirm something, I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my ear to his chest. Indeed, there was no heartbeat. I extended my right index and middle fingers and placed them under his nose. Indeed, there was no breath either. What in the world was happening? As if sensing my stealthy actions, the body lying neatly on the bed suddenly opened its eyes, staring intently at me, catching me off guard. But those eyes were dull, like those of a dead fish. I understood his meaning perfectly. He was asking if I had finished playing. I gave an awkward smile, gently embraced his body on the bed in a fawning manner, and buried my head in the hollow of his neck. His body was truly icy cold, so cold it made me shiver. And then I understood everything clearly. I couldn't let go. If I let go now, what would become of him? No matter how hopeless the situation, with the right approach, it could surely be resolved. Even without breath or a beating heart, I, from the beginning, still yearned, longed, even if it meant being unilaterally devoted. Just like that, I remained in that embrace. I don't know how much time had passed, perhaps a few minutes or maybe 15. Suddenly, I caught an unpleasant metallic scent of blood. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the smell grew stronger and stronger, similar to the odor in raw meat markets. I frowned, sat up, and searched for the source of the smell. The bedsheet was stained red. Anxiously, I looked for the wound, even feeling beads of sweat forming on the tip of my nose. His vacant eyes were silently fixed on me. Then, seeing my face on the verge of tears, he raised his left hand and spread his palm. In his palm was a row of small, perfectly aligned holes, 4 of them. A dark red, semi-solid substance slowly dripped from them. It was hard to tell if it was blood or pulverized flesh. It looked as if he had clenched his fist so tightly that his fingertips had pierced deep into his own palm. He lay on the bed, his chest rising and falling with great difficulty, struggling to make his vocal cords vibrate, and spoke to me in a thick, hoarse voice that was barely audible. He said, "No feeling," as if each syllable uttered cost him a significant amount of life force. I couldn't say a word, or rather, I didn't know what words to say to comfort him. But even if I did, they would only be superficial pleasantries, devoid of meaning. Because those glib words that anyone could say wouldn't truly change anything. My mind slowly dulled. In those few minutes, I forgot that I should have gotten the first aid kit to treat his wound. It wasn't until his other hand gently stroked my hair that I looked at him again, at his pale face. The young man before me had sat up with a slight stiffness in his movements. He softly stroked my hair, while still struggling to control the muscles in his face to form a smile. I felt that it must have been a smile. I let out a laugh, a truly crooked smile. "You," I heard myself say, and then I realized I was also sporting a crooked smile just like his. It was just like in childhood, a wide grin received when given candy. He said nothing more, did nothing else, just continued to hold my head. I could feel his icy fingers gently stroking my hair. This coldness at this moment felt so intimate and warm to me. Yes, warm. Not the ordinary warmth one could usually feel, but a kind of warmth that could quell all fears, warming my very soul. I pulled his intact arm from the top of my head and pressed it to my face, telling myself to be strong. Because from now on, no one would tell me what to do, and there would be no more capable senior to emulate. This whole world was left with just the 2 of us. 2 people who had encountered a strange phenomenon they couldn't tell anyone about. Perhaps he had noticed the strangeness of his body from early the day before. That's why he only worked for half a day before quitting. But even so, this sudden request, combined with his discomfort, caused an argument with his superior, though in the end, he peacefully got his wish. Yesterday, he had left too quickly, so quickly that he rushed out of that reinforced concrete building all by himself, only to come and tightly grasp my hands. I was sure that no matter what, I couldn't truly understand his emotions at that moment, so I told myself to dismiss any empty, fake words pretending to understand. What he needed now, perhaps, was just breakfast. What he needed was to be treated like a normal human being. His murky eyes looked up at the bowl of porridge I was carrying. He shook his head again and again, then dragged his body to the living room. I felt a slight pang of disappointment, then told myself perhaps his current physical state didn't require food or drink. Proud of my flawless role-playing ability and strong acceptance, I finished my lonely lunch, told him I was going out. He was still watching TV in the living room, and then left to take care of his affairs. Many of his belongings were still at work, and I had to go collect them. I also had to endure his superior's grumpy face. It took all morning, talking until my throat was raw, plus smiling and apologizing. And then, finally, I walked down the street, carrying a cardboard box filled with his office supplies. In this bustling metropolis, the disappearance of one individual wouldn't attract anyone's attention. It was hard to believe. Yet I was contemplating and pondering why he had become like this. There were no cadaveric spots, no rigor mortis as described in books. Every movement he made this morning was as flexible as a normal person's. The only differences were the absence of breath, heartbeat, a cold body, vacant eyes, and nerves that no longer registered pain. After several hesitations, I decided to visit the hospital. I figured if I just pretended to be seeking advice, it wouldn't be a problem. The result was that the doctor kicked me out of the clinic. I asked the doctor, "Someone without breath or a heartbeat is dead, right?" The doctor replied, "Academically, complete death is only when the brain is dead." I asked, "What about the time frame?" The doctor answered, From a few seconds to a few tens of minutes, it varies per person. I asked, so what happens if a person can't feel pain anymore? The doctor said, analgesia perhaps. The causes are diverse, very many. I cannot conclude based on such vague descriptions. I asked the doctor, what about a wound in the palm that cannot close? The doctor paused. I asked the doctor, what if someone has all the above symptoms and their belly is also slightly distended? The doctor asked back, what exactly are you here for? Kicked out of the clinic, I wandered the streets, hugging the cardboard box. Though my heart yearned to return home to him immediately, I knew now more than ever that as soon as I crossed the threshold, everything would be reduced to his body as it was in that moment. There was no time to ponder these words, no time to think about the future, about our story. What should I do? At the very least, before he could return to normal, this was something I needed to carefully consider and then act upon naturally. The premise being that he could return to normal. At dusk, after buying food from his favorite restaurant, I pushed open the door of our home and called his name loudly, but no one answered. The living room was empty, the dining room was empty, the bedroom was empty. I frowned. In his current state, he surely wouldn't choose to run out into the street, absolutely not. I opened the shoe cabinet. Indeed, his shoes were all there, not a pair missing. So what was going on? I placed the food box on the table, noticing the TV in the living room was still slightly warm. Then, a faint sound echoed from the bathroom. What was that? So he was in there, causing me to break out in cold sweat. I shrugged, walking with a quick, soft pace towards it, and opened the bathroom door. And then I regretted it. No, even if I had knocked, it wouldn't have changed what was happening inside. A pungent, indescribable stench. I wasn't even sure what it was. Perhaps it was repulsive, but more than that, it was unbearable, assaulting my face directly from within. He was sitting in the bathtub. In the tub, a dark red liquid was turning gradually black or yellowish-brown, spreading like leaf-like stains across the water. He turned his head to look at me. One of his eyeballs had been destroyed. I stared at him in silent horror. Unable to control my emotions, I wanted to scream, and my legs felt like jelly. This sight before me, something I had only ever seen on the screens of horror movies, was now vividly real in my own bathroom. And the young man before me, him, or rather, the mere thought of using words like him, made that strange negative emotion vanish completely. Even my trembling legs were just the residue of a fleeting illusion. "You're so careless," I yelled. "Even if you can't feel pain, you shouldn't treat your body like this. What a waste of my time." Outside, I was racking my brain, trying to figure out how to help you control the situation and return to your old self. I had never been this angry, at least I had never yelled at him like this. After shouting, even breathing became difficult, and I didn't even care if he heard or understood. I stomped straight to the bathtub, intending to pull him to his feet. But when my gaze fell upon a certain point, my entire body instantly froze in place. His abdomen? How should I describe it? It must have been his internal organs. Several segments of his intestines floated, bloated on the surface of the water, spanning across his abdominal cavity. What was once known as the human belly was now a deep, wide cavity, clearly exposing his lowest ribs. Beneath that, there were several fleshy masses, similar to newly grown animal organs. The intestines could be vaguely identified by their appearance and the viscous yellow fat particles I used to tease him about, saying they were growing every day. Above that cavity, a part of what might have been his lung seemed still visible, now peacefully slumbering in a body devoid of any sign of life. Is this what a human corpse looks like? For a long time, I couldn't utter a word. I took a deep breath, controlled my emotions, and then immediately found the core of the issue. "Do you enjoy torturing yourself like this?" I used both hands to turn his icy face to confront mine. His one remaining eye, murky and vacant, must have been looking at me. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. Then, finally unable to bear it, I softened my voice, the grip in my hands gradually loosening into a gentle hold. "You can't speak anymore, can you?" He nodded, then extended his blood-stained hands, separating mine from his, and with nimble fingertips wrote on my palm, "Stomach, gas inside, putrid. Organs, especially stomach and intestines. Because they contain many types of bacteria and nutrients, they are usually the parts most easily decomposed after death. And a large number of diverse bacteria proliferating will produce gas. Eventually, the skin can no longer contain it and tears open." Suddenly, I remembered something I had once read. "So this is what it is. You're dead, aren't you?" The person sitting before me was a real corpse. Unable to control myself, I kissed his cold lips. It's okay, what if he is a corpse? With a strange confidence from who knows where, I squeezed his hand tightly, a smile on my face. I began to clean up the scene of the cadaver dissection in the bathtub. I forcibly lifted him, who remained stubbornly in place, out of the bathtub. Then I fumbled through the blood-streaked tub and found the drain plug. The dark red water, carrying its pungent odor, gushed down, forming a small whirlpool. But the white porcelain walls of the tub were still covered in skin-colored foam, and a large amount of tissue and body parts remained at the bottom. I felt weary. Then, the diluted blood on my hands smeared across my face. Instantly, I realized that my eyes and nostrils had gradually become accustomed to these sights and smells. Suddenly unsure of what expression to wear, I felt unable to look at my somewhat biased feelings objectively anymore. If I were to speak of the beginning of all this, I turned to look at him, who was still standing beside me. Whatever was dripping from him, I couldn't quite tell what liquid it was had dried into a small reddish-brown puddle on the tile floor beneath his feet. And he himself just stood there, at a loss like a child. What remained of him? His one pupil had long dissolved, the vitreous humor was cloudy, his eyes, no longer clear, were cast down as if intently looking at a spot on the floor. After a moment of silence, I also stopped what I was doing, my lips parted, but no words came out. Perhaps it was the sorrow in my heart, a searing pain, like needles piercing, starting from my heart cavity and spreading throughout my chest. As if sensing my intense gaze, he slowly looked up and stepped closer, leaving a trail of blood-red footprints on the pale tiled floor. Then he did something I completely didn't expect. He picked up the shower head, turned on the tap, and used the water to clean the inside of the bathtub. Then, without hesitation, he washed everything off his own body, letting it drain away. I was stunned. The resolute back of this corpse somehow seemed taller than ever before. Then I guessed his thoughts. He had once told me that solving the immediate problem was more important than trying to argue his way out. So I shook my head and began to clean this bathroom, which looked no different from a slaughterhouse. I flushed all the blood from the bathtub down the drain, used a rag to wipe all traces from the floor, and used 2 whole rolls of toilet paper to dry him, especially his hollow abdomen. Although I said dried, it seemed there was still quite a bit of. I wasn't sure what to do. I trembled just a second before reaching into that empty abdominal cavity, but then I quickly pulled back. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but I felt his gaze. I swallowed, slowly extending my hand into his belly. It was a truly indescribable feeling, especially as my mind kept exaggerating. This is his belly, my hand is inside his body. Yes, inside his body. I could feel my heart pounding fast and strong. The temperature in my cheeks gradually rose. My hand, holding a piece of paper to absorb the water, touched the dangling flesh inside him. Compared to the icy coldness there, my fingertips still felt warm. The sensation was similar to the meat I used to prepare in the kitchen, but comparing him to beef and pork at this moment felt crude. I silently chastised myself and carefully absorbed all from his abdominal cavity with paper towels. Done, I could feel sweat breaking out on my forehead and the tip of my nose. I exhaled deeply, then sat down on the tiled floor in the bathroom and looked up, smiling at him. His face still held a vacant expression, discernible from the distorted shape of his facial muscles. I guessed he was smiling. His cold hand rested on my hair. I felt this movement was probably a normal caress. Then he pointed to what remained at the bottom of the bathtub. "Forgive me, if you were still normal now, I would definitely slap you." And indeed, I did, though my hand was much lighter. I stood up, patted his cheeks, the sensation on my fingertips reminding me of refrigerated meat still packaged for sale in the supermarket. "You know what?" I said to him. "Don't tell me there's more to do just when I was about to rest." He nodded. Then I forced myself to suppress the urge to. Even though he was already dead, and turned my attention to the body fragments at the bottom of the tub. How to dispose of them? Common knowledge, countless movies, and novels told me that throwing them directly into the trash was foolish. If I wanted these things to gradually disappear silently in the room, the best method seemed to be to corrode them with chemicals. But not to mention that I didn't have any of those at home now, just finding them would be a problem. So I decided to deal with the newly emerged trash first. I gathered all the blood-stained toilet paper, as if from a crime scene, brought it to the kitchen, poured cooking oil over it, and then set it all on fire until nothing remained. Gray smoke billowed up into the range hood. I thought this would surely leave no traces. After thoroughly scrubbing away the black residue at the bottom of the pot, I returned to the bathroom, suppressed the strange feeling, gathered all his body parts from the bottom of the tub, wrapped them in plastic wrap, and then put them in the freezer. I thought this long, tiring day was probably over. Tomorrow, I definitely needed to find a place to properly dispose of the human flesh. I didn't even dare to open the windows or the ventilator, only lighting a scented candle. I ate the cold takeout alone and casually played with his tongue for a while. I must not be a pervert, so please pay no mind to these details. Specifically, I was playfully asking him if he wanted dinner. After he immediately shook his head, I began to wonder why those cold tissues could still move and why there were no cadaveric spots, as people usually said, and whether it was due to a change in his voice that made him unwilling to speak, or if he truly couldn't speak. To confirm this odd, new idea that had suddenly sprung up, he sat down on the chair opposite me. I sat on his body, causing the muscles on his thighs to deform, used my hand to pry open his mouth, and inserted my finger. He flinched slightly, but couldn't find a suitable expression. He looked adorable no matter how I saw it. Perhaps I should say, in his current state, he was hardly capable of showing any expression anymore. I curled my finger and poked him. The faint smile from a second ago instantly turned into a frown. His tongue was completely unresponsive, like a dead fish. Although I didn't expect him to react to this action, shouldn't his sensory nervous system at least direct some unconditional reflex? Yet, his expression remained exactly the same as before. His tongue, that piece of flesh, lay as if rigidly dead in what was called his oral cavity. The sensation that completely occupied me when I pried open his lower jaw earlier was the grinding of bones. A faint thought began to surface in my mind. How pitiful. My eyes narrowed, and I seemed to hear a voice from my own mouth. In reality, it wasn't the muscles that could still move, but the skeleton trying to make the flesh move with it. His hands, hanging loosely at his sides, wrapped around my waist. His discolored skin showed a hint of blood under the bright light. I withdrew my fingers from his oral cavity, pulled his head close, and hugged him tightly to my chest. "It's okay, it's okay." As if wanting to transfer my body heat to him, I pressed myself as close as possible to his icy skin. I told myself, "It's okay, no matter what, you're still you." That night, he insisted on sleeping in the bathroom. I hugged my pillow, wanting to sleep with him, but he pushed me back into our bedroom. I didn't sleep a wink. At dawn the next day, I opened the wooden door of the bathroom. On this third midsummer day, my boyfriend began to decompose. I started searching online for common household tips. No, for how to dispose of a corpse. Finally, after seeing a picture of an experiment on animal flesh, I almost lost all hope. Especially when that charred bone appeared before my eyes. Not to mention the immense damage such an act would inflict on the corpse currently in my bathroom. Just obtaining a large amount of concentrated acid required me to cross half the city and even provide my ID card. At times like these, I couldn't help but marvel at how well-equipped the laboratories of those who conducted such practical experiments must be. But even in a laboratory, one could only get a small amount, not enough to decompose an entire rotting corpse. I shrugged, finally turned off the computer, and then walked into the bathroom, which was filled with a ceaseless whirring sound. Hours earlier, I finally couldn't stand the stench and decided to turn on the exhaust fan, if only for a moment. If before there had only been the metallic smell of blood and raw meat, the smell that morning, nurtured throughout the summer night, or perhaps even starting from 2 nights prior, was in that unventilated bathroom, unequivocally the foul stench of a dead body, as people called it. His legs were curled up, him sitting hunched on the porcelain tiles between the bathtub and the sink. This posture easily brought to mind bullied students in school. Oh, if only he weren't tearing at his own flesh with his hands. I took a few deep breaths, letting my nasal mucosa get used to the smell. Then I knelt before him and asked, as if he were still normal, "Do you really not feel any pain at all?" Honestly, I looked at him and felt immense sorrow. His right fingertip, with the white bone exposed, was plucking a piece of rotting flesh from his own body. His figure, which could never truly be called tall, was now marred by countless crisscrossing wounds he had torn himself, with many spots even revealing white bone and the bright pink hue of his flesh that hadn't yet decayed. It was exactly like the fresh red color of ribs hanging in raw meat stalls. What difference, after all, is there between humans and other animals? If even the color of the flesh that makes up our bodies is the same, then where does the so-called difference come from? If another species were to dominate this planet, would humanity become a delicious dish on someone's table? I tilted my head, pondering this question, my finger brushing across his chest, leaving a red, meaty streak. The sensation now was no longer that icy coldness, but still a temperature no normal person should have. The distance between my finger and his heart was only the width of a rib. Through the gap between the ribs, I saw the mass of flesh that was perhaps his heart. Under the bright white bathroom light, even the blood vessels on his face were clearly visible. A surge of strength gradually enveloped my cheeks. It was his other arm. Compared to his right hand, his left hand was still much more intact. He used his fingers to write on my palm. What's wrong? It seemed he knew what I had been doing for the past few hours. I let out a long sigh, shaking my head at his discolored face. A prolonged silence, occasionally broken by the sound of water dripping onto the tiles, the sound of his dripping down. I didn't know what to do with him anymore, but at least one thing was crystal clear. If I didn't clean all this up, the police would soon be knocking at our door. I wasn't sure when the sewer workers might detect abnormalities in the liquids draining from our apartment, but this unbearable smell could very well have spread throughout the entire floor or been carried by the ventilation system to who knows where. I shook my head vigorously, deciding not to think about these unsettling matters for now. I knelt before him and said with solemnity, "I want to talk about something with you. I want to make it clear to you once and for all." On his stiff face, he was trying his best to form a bewildered expression, genuinely adorably bewildered. I tilted my head and continued to explain my reason, because I just saw your heart. People deeply in love often say things like, "My love fills your heart," or "You can just pull out your heart and show it to me," or "You occupy my heart," and so on. Isn't seeing your lover's heart a very romantic thing? So I looked deep into his eyes, even though his one remaining eye was sunken, and said, "I love you." If you love someone, and you only love their superficial appearance, then it's truly shallow, because sooner or later, flesh will become a thing of the past. So how long will the so-called beloved voice, beloved personality, beloved demeanor, beloved soul truly last? Indeed, for a normal person, these things are very difficult to disappear or change. For those who truly feel the existence of love, perhaps this is just a trivial matter, like a dog complaining about a cat's fur. To find a unique, indelible point, to consider it the reason for one's love, to elevate the value of one's feelings. Yet there are always exceptions in this world. Some people will completely disappear. All the things that made him a normal human being, including his physical appearance, his voice, personality, demeanor, and true soul. But I have always loved you. Such a deep, bone-deep love that even I, who fears ghost movies the most, can bravely face the situation in this house that looks exactly like a murder scene. But he, right in front of me, had no reaction whatsoever. I smiled and repeated my earlier statement. I said I love you. And then he lunged forward and hugged me tightly. His strength made me fall to the ground with a thud. He held me so powerfully that his exposed bones pressed painfully into my body. I was sure my skin and nightclothes were stained with everything from his body. So what? I reached out and returned his embrace, gently patting his back, and touched my lips to his cold ear. A few minutes later, as if he had finally made a decision, his fingers traced more characters on my back. "Make me consumed, with your gastric juices." I couldn't refuse him. There were a total of 4 knives in the house. A large chef's knife for mincing meat, a small chef's knife for slicing vegetables, a large fruit knife for cutting fruit, a small fruit knife for peeling fruit. At this very moment, all of them were in my hands, lined up before me in the bathroom. He extended an arm towards me, his meaning roughly, "Start there." My right hand picked up the larger fruit knife, raised it, and then reached towards his arm. My wrist trembled continuously. No, my whole body was trembling continuously. Everything before my eyes blurred, I couldn't see clearly. My arm was clearly extending at a steady pace, but in my eyes it seemed to slow down several times over. If this continued. A clang rang out, the knife in my hand fell to the ground. Finally, I burst into tears. Since everything began, this was the first time I had cried. It wasn't that I didn't know what to do next, but that I couldn't tell if continuing like this was the right decision. He picked up the knife and placed it back in my hand. I was still sobbing loudly. Then he tightly grasped my wrist, forcing me to plunge the blade into his shoulder. My tears streamed down like a flood, refracting and distorting the light. I saw his exposed flesh at the cut's edge. Ha ha, it was exactly as I had imagined, like the color of raw meat sold in a supermarket. As if once things started, they would only get worse, unstoppable. I violently tore off the undecayed parts of his body with an almost brutal motion and immediately stuffed them into my mouth. It was all this man's fault. Everything was brought on by him. I only remember that day I cried and ravenously swallowed the raw meat in my mouth, barely noticing its taste. And then, his arm, now reduced to white bone, reached out and stroked my hair, gently patted my back, and soothed my broken sobs with such tenderness. So tenderly that I just wanted to cry forever. If you ask me what human flesh tastes like, I don't think I can answer. Even though I devoured a remaining part of him. Perhaps it tasted somewhat like the raw meat section in a supermarket. Perhaps it tasted somewhat like pre-mixed minced meat. Perhaps it tasted somewhat like raw fish slices eaten in coastal areas. Generally, it was a soft, cold slab of meat. The metallic taste swallowed into my stomach made it distended, as if every exhale pushed my blood back up. I looked at him, his stark white bone exposed, and cautiously smiled. The corpse before me still hesitated slightly, not daring to tear off the dangling fragments of flesh from his bones. With my pitiful ability to discern and my meager medical knowledge, I could vaguely see that only cartilage, pulverized flesh, tough tendons, and the inside of his ribs remained. I couldn't reach in with my hand, and I couldn't clearly tell what organs they were. My entire body at this moment must have been covered in blood, just like his stark white skeleton. I thought he was probably smiling too. Even though he could no longer manage even a stiff, bewildered expression, only his upper and lower jawbones clattered together with a dry sound. I extended my finger and pressed it against his blood-stained lower teeth. His upper teeth lowered, gently biting my fingertip. "You really look like a minor villain from a horror movie now," I joked, clearing the rotting meat fragments from his skull behind his teeth. His jaw, still biting my finger, clenched slightly, and his empty, dark eye socket seemed to convey his displeasure. Oh, the problem I had always ignored suddenly popped into my head. I gasped, quickly pulled out my finger, and almost jumped up. His cervical vertebrae creaked as he lifted his head to look at me, who had just sprung to my feet. That's right, his eyeballs were clearly gone, white bone was exposed on his face, yet I still had to use the verb, look. My hands traced the empty sockets of his eyes, and I asked, "Can you see me?" He nodded. "Can you hear me too?" He nodded, looking as if this question was foolish. Of course, that expression was just my own imagination. "How strange," I marveled, then moved my hands, gently gliding them down his body. His organs were now only soft cartilage and a few bits of rotting flesh, but his nervous system could still perceive normally. His tendons and muscles had necrotized and decayed, but his skeleton could still move normally. The location of his brain in his skull was empty, but his consciousness could still think normally. No, perhaps the most inexplicable thing had existed from the very beginning. Why had he lost his breath and heartbeat? I decided not to think about these unpleasant things anymore. So I told him, "Let's clean everything up quickly." He nodded again, then silently looked at one of the bathroom walls, where the mop, used to scrub bloodstains from the floor these past few days, leaned. He thought I meant cleaning the room. What I actually meant was that I wanted to thoroughly clean his skeleton, which at this moment looked like nothing human. I firmly grasped his arm bone and dragged him into the bathtub. Ignoring his bewildered look, I picked up the shower head, turned on the water, and sprayed it directly into his skull. The young man in the tub reflexively used his hand to block it, to avoid choking on the water. But then his hand, now only 5 bare bone branches, couldn't block any water. And his nostrils, along with his non-functioning respiratory system, couldn't choke either. I doubled over with laughter, laughing so hard I couldn't firmly hold the showerhead, clutching my stomach and almost collapsing on the edge of the tub. I felt this was the first time in my life I had laughed like that. In just a few hours, from crying until voiceless to laughing until breathless, looking across the whole world, there was probably only me. And the young man in the tub still seemed to be staring intently at me with a rather unhappy gaze. Then, from some unknown childish impulse, I felt the cold skeleton grasp my shoulder with astonishing strength. Immediately, my head was pushed down into the bathtub, into water mixed with a pale plasma layer. Luckily, he supported me. Although bumping into his bones hurt a lot, it was still much better than hitting the porcelain side of the tub. In my flailing, I grabbed a handful of flesh, unsure which part of his remaining body it was, and then, most unromantically, I choked. Yes, me. The one who had just laughed at him for not being able to choke, a few seconds earlier, was now choking on water, and moreover, coughing terribly as if on the verge of death. Of course, the cause of this near-death coughing fit was my uncontrollable laughter, even while choking. He laughed too. I felt it because he pressed his poor, stark, white finger bone against my forehead. I tried to suppress my excitement, exhaling slowly and deeply. The feeling of my wet clothes clinging to my body was very uncomfortable, so I unbuttoned my top, and with a slight mischievous intent, before this skeleton still adorned with a few loose pieces of flesh, I stripped naked with a calm expression. Truly an odd shared bath. To be precise, after rinsing off the bloodstains from my own body, I began to roughly scrub his body. Using the eyebrow scissors from the bathroom shelf, I carefully trimmed away the remaining tissues on his body. People can truly change a lot in a short time. I found myself so frightening that even I couldn't believe it. While using the eyebrow scissors to cut away pieces of human flesh, I felt no hesitation or trembling whatsoever. Even when I heard the scraping sound of the scissors cutting through cartilage, I had no unusual emotions. Without these unsightly impurities, his skeleton would be a purer existence than white snow. It would decay eventually anyway. I wanted his perfect, beautiful skeleton. That cold skeleton often pressed against my warm skin. Slimy blood and flesh would occasionally cling to me. I had long grown used to this peculiar smell, even feeling a warm breath. That breath seemed to linger in the deep recesses of life and death, making me shiver with joy. Gradually, the breathing became rapid. It was as if his lost breath was pressing down on my body, along with my heart beating many times faster. Warm steam slowly rose from the cramped bathtub. Using the steam, I extended my fingers into the empty eye sockets, between his ribs, and even into the gaps of his pelvis, cleaning every nook and cranny inside him. My mind felt like it had lost a piece, and for a moment I couldn't distinguish whether I was cleaning him or merely satisfying some perverse desire within me. I wanted to reach inside his body, plunge into the holes on him. Having gone through this, the reason why ancient fertility cults were often associated with tentacled monsters could now be understood. Because this truly was. I pressed my lips against his exposed teeth, vaguely tracing half his face with my tongue. Then my hand suddenly tore off the remaining half of his scalp with force. My lover, my corpse, my skeleton. I lifted his wrist bone and rubbed it against my burning flesh, just like when we used to caress each other before. The greatest lesson this world taught me is that it will never allow you smooth sailing. Even if smooth sailing is just a relatively temporary phrase. From that afternoon, my stomach began to ache faintly. At first it was bearable, then it gradually became more intense, and finally I had to double over, lying still on the bed. Actually, if I thought about it carefully, it would be strange if I, who only ever dared to eat 8-minute steak, had no reaction. Finally, 3 hours later, I stumbled on unsteady feet directly into the toilet. Hugging the toilet bowl, I began to vomit a mixture of gastric juices, thick with the smell of hydrochloric acid and the pungent, nauseating odor of raw meat. It came back up the same way I had tried to swallow it not long before, passing through my esophagus, overflowing my throat, and finally gushing out through my mouth and nose. Tears mingled with the vomit, streaming down my face. I looked at the foul contents in the toilet. The initial physiological tears gradually turned into emotional tears. I truly was terrible. I was a deceiver. I had clearly said I wanted to truly unite with him to become one, but now I had lost him. I had vomited him out of my stomach, removed him from my body, completely dissolved. From the living room, the skeleton walked in. Its hand, now only white bone, picked up a towel, intending to wipe my face clean. The sensation of those finger bones, wrapped in a thin layer of towel, was still sharp enough to make me wince. I bowed my head, unsure what to say. He stubbornly continued to wipe my face clean, then gently patted my back, surely to comfort me. This man truly wasn't adorable at all at this moment. While his lover worried about whether she might get fat from breaking her promise, he should at least pretend to be angry. I didn't understand his intentions. Finally, I looked at in the toilet bowl, then slammed the lid shut and flushed. The sound of water rushing through the siphon echoed. I felt something had disappeared, yet I couldn't specify what. Perhaps it was the parts that made him a normal human being or the soul of a normal human being. In short, a certain past between us had been flushed down the drain, and I feared I would never be able to retrieve it in this lifetime. The unknown future would be a completely new beginning. I braced my hands on the basin and washed my face. He gently wrapped his arms around me from behind, his protruding teeth grinding against the back of my neck. Perhaps he was kissing me. Since everything began, this was the first time he had initiated a kiss. I held his skull tightly. Recognizing the wonderful sensation beneath my hands, I began to caress him. "I'm going to cook some porridge for dinner. My stomach still hurts, you see." His two bony arms tightened, saying nothing, unable to speak. "It's all your fault," I said. His hands loosened, and he stood silently behind me like a schoolboy waiting to be punished. In the mirror before me, I could see him slowly bending lower and lower. Then, "Ah!" I shrieked. I don't know which cervical bone broke, but his entire skull fell to the ground. In that moment, I felt my entire body go cold, my legs turned to jelly, and I thought I would collapse instantly. My ears rang, as if the whole world was slipping away from me. It was an emotion called panic, filling my soul in a brief flash. His skeleton stood stiffly for a few seconds, then slowly, very slowly, sat down. His bony hand picked up his head and reattached it to its place, everything just as it was before the unexpected incident. My mouth hung open. I thought for a long time but couldn't utter a word, finally resigned to turning away and going into the kitchen to cook a bowl of thin porridge for my poor, aching stomach. He truly was a damn scoundrel. Though it was uncertain whether he was dead or not, he was certainly not alive. After eating, I returned to bed to let my still aching stomach rest properly. I wrapped myself tightly in the thin summer blanket, faced the wall, and curled up, completely sleepless. If you ask why I couldn't sleep, the damn scoundrel I mentioned several times before was now kneeling face down on the floor along the edge of the bed, his gaze piercing through his deep, empty eye sockets, staring fixedly at me, making my spine crawl. In the end, I was the one who surrendered. When you turn over and realize there's a skeleton staring intently at you, this sentence should stop here. No need to say the second half, because it's already a scene that could only appear in a horror movie. I let out a sigh and asked him, "Tell me, should I scream now or should I just hit you with a pillow?" His teeth clattered together, making clicking sounds. He reached out and tugged at a corner of my blanket. I smoothed my hair back, shifted slightly inward, making space. I said, "Come up here. You're a clean skeleton now anyway, you won't get the bed dirty." The skeleton seemed to brighten considerably, then lay down in his usual spot. My only sensation that night was that human bones are truly hard. The new day was heralded by a series of continuous doorbell rings. As I groggily rubbed my blurry, sleep-filled eyes, the ringing continued relentlessly, even accompanied by impatient banging on the door. His reaction and movements were incredibly instinctive and swift. In a flash, he had crawled out of bed and hidden in the wardrobe. I slipped on my slippers and walked to the front door, mentally guessing who could be on the other side. Then, after opening the door and clearly seeing who it was, everything became meaningless and unimportant. It was a midsummer morning, occasionally feeling a bit cool. 2 police officers stood outside my house, in neat, crisp uniforms, saying something with cold expressions. My mind cleared in mere seconds. The suddenness of the event made me unable to clearly hear what they were saying. It wasn't until one of them repeatedly called my name that I reacted and asked them what they wanted. They asked if they could come in for a cup of tea. I said, "Of course." Then I leaned to the side, clearing the path from the door to the hallway and into the living room. As I expected, they slowly began with trivial questions that could be asked or not, eventually leading to my roommate. Throughout the whole process, I thought a lot. I thought of the parts of his internal organs I had left in the freezer. I thought of the countless remnants of him that must still be in the drain. I thought of the eyebrow scissors still stained with his unwashed blood. So much so that when answering their questions, when fabricating absurd, foolish statements like never having heard anything, I was so distracted and indifferent. I was sure they suspected me. I also secretly felt lucky that these 2 officers merely questioned me with suspicious eyes and didn't take an extra step to search the apartment. They must have had some evidence, perhaps after the sewer workers discovered suspicious objects and reported them to the police. Or perhaps the neighbors had smelled the strange odor and heard my screams. Whatever the case, In such a prosperous and vast metropolis, no one would notice the disappearance of one person. After seeing them off, I felt an extreme sense of panic. He emerged from the wardrobe in the bedroom and stood silently beside me. I told him, "We need to figure something out. We can't stay here anymore. We need to escape to somewhere without too many constraints." That night, I disassembled him into small pieces and packed him into my travel suitcase. The only 4 words that mattered in our world were, "Get out of here." To an unknown destination. This was a coastal city near the border, nestled in a corner of the continent, blessed by nature with surrounding seas that were calm year-round. It later became a famous port city and could also be said to be one of the places with the most complex demographic fluctuations on the mainland. I arrived here 3 months ago, deciding to temporarily stay 2.5 months ago. Using my meager savings after deducting travel expenses, I used part of the money to rent an attic apartment by the harbor. Sticky sea breeze continually rushed into the room from the distant, emerald blue ocean, blowing the old curtains. In such a damp space, I began to worry for his skeleton. Fortunately, in a coastal city like this, everything was much better. Even restricted items were sold without anyone caring about the buyer's identity. This included lye, gasoline, and hydrogen peroxide. It also included bone drills, wire cutters, and chrome-plated clamps. While worrying whether he would feel pain when I extracted his bone marrow, or if he would be uncomfortable during bleaching, I completed this task. Of course, looking back now, keeping his entire body submerged in some solution for a week, occasionally prodding his leg bones in the water, was truly, truly excessive. In short, the yellowish bones had now turned impeccably white. The first time I saw them, the joints, fixed with tendons and nylon wires, wouldn't easily fall apart. Fearing that passers-by might discover us, I rarely opened the window and never went out alone. Occasionally, I would hide in a dark corner of the attic to startle people. This was my boyfriend, the one I loved most sincerely. Sometimes I would disassemble him, pack him into a suitcase, and carry him down to the bustling harbor where there was nowhere to play, right below the window. The timing wasn't fixed. To put it another way, it depended on my mood. Sometimes twice or thrice a week, sometimes 3 or 4 times a month. At the bustling port, frequented by merchant ships from various countries, artists often gathered. Roughly speaking, I was the newest to join. Saying join might not be entirely accurate, because most of these artists traveled the world on merchant ships, disembarking and staying each time they docked at a port or a land. How long could I stay in this coastal city? I don't think I knew. If I had to endure additional time constraints, would it be when the money I earned decreased? That's right, the art I practiced at this port was a form of magic. That's what I called it more precisely, a type of magic focused on seeking the unusual. Among the curious onlookers, there were also children crying out in fear. My magic was making a human skeleton move without any visible aid. Some guessed I secretly used fishing lines to control him. Others guessed the skeleton was actually a wind-up toy. But these weren't the main point. The main point was that he had recently learned how to use his pathetic leg bones for addition and subtraction, or, well, how to pat the head of a crying child, making the child cry even more fiercely. No matter what, being able to earn more money already made him a good man. Oh, I should say, good skeleton, shouldn't I? I shrugged. After I heard the landlord and others whispering about me being a witch at the stairwell, I bought black fabric to sew a discreet, modest cloak. I also decorated our small attic apartment to resemble a witch's room. Afterward, the old woman with many wrinkles, who came to collect rent, no longer dared to enter the small realm that was mine and his. Only today, when I went out to buy dinner, I still noticed the woman across the street pointing and gesticulating behind my back, muttering phrases like bad omen, witch. I just smiled, paying no attention. In modern society, sometimes suppressed superstitions only erupt more powerfully. It's better to say that my boyfriend had already become a supernatural entity. I hugged the newly bought fast food box to my chest, returning to what I temporarily called home. The skeleton was still curled up on the bed, bored, flipping through TV channels. As soon as he saw me, he stood up and gave me a wide, open embrace. How much longer could we stay here? I didn't know. I thought tomorrow I should inquire about the nearest passenger ship's destination. Then, as long as I was with him, no matter where, it wouldn't matter.